This lesson will take us through the last 3 decades of the 20th century Black American experience. Content is taken from Chapter 16 of your text. Let's begin. In looking at the seeds for the Black Power movement, along with early ideas about Black Power, global decolonization, and the rise of new nation-states in Africa inspired African American activists to see past white alliances and reject white conceptions of blackness. The 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in September of 1963, along with the uprisings that followed and the assassination of President Kennedy, fostered new attitudes among blacks about the pace of progress in the movement. Kennedy's successor, Lyndon Johnson, did offer some hope by working hard to pass the Civil Rights Bill of 1964. The bill was the most significant of its kind since Reconstruction, barring discrimination in public places, striking down discrimination in federal programs, and instituting enforcement for desegregation. Title VII of the bill banned discrimination in employment and created a new agency, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, also known as the EEOC, to investigate and litigate cases of job discrimination. But some in the civil rights establishment, like SNCC's John Lewis, felt that the bill wasn't enough and represented efforts that were too little, too late. They argued that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 didn't protect blacks from white violence or police brutality, nor did it secure black voting rights or do enough to ensure job equity, and it didn't address the problem of institutional segregation in housing. So it's against this backdrop that we see the emergence of bolder, newer, more urgent voices in the struggle for civil rights in America. One such voice was Malcolm X. Malcolm X was born Malcolm Little on May 19, 1925 in Omaha, Nebraska. His mother, Louise Norton Little, was a homemaker who was occupied with the family's 8 children. His father was Earl Little and was an outspoken Baptist minister and avid supporter of Black nationalist leader Marcus Garvey. Earl's civil rights activism prompted death threats from the white supremacist organization Black Legion, forcing the family to relocate twice before Malcolm's 4th birthday. Regardless of the Littles' efforts to elude the Legion, in 1929, their Lansing, Michigan home was burned to the ground. 2 years later, Earl's body was found lying across the town's trolley tracks. Police ruled both incidents as accidents, but the Littles were certain that members of the Black Legion were responsible. Louise suffered emotional breakdown several years after the death of her husband and was committed to a mental institution, while her children were split up among various foster homes and orphanages. Eventually, Malcolm and his longtime friend, Malcolm Shorty Jarvis, moved back to Boston. In 1946, they were arrested and convicted on burglary charges, and Malcolm was sentenced to 10 years in prison, although he was granted parole after serving 7 of these years. Malcolm's brother Reginald would visit and discuss his recent conversion to the Muslim religion. Reginald belonged to the religious organization known as the Nation of Islam. Intrigued, Malcolm began to study the teachings of NOI leader Elijah Muhammad. Muhammad taught that white society actively worked to keep African Americans from empowering themselves and achieving political, economic, and social success. Among other goals, the NOI fought for a state of their own, separate from one inhabited by white people. By the time he was paroled in 1952, Malcolm was a devoted follower with the new surname X. He considered Little a slave name and chose the X to signify his lost tribal name. Intelligent and articulate, Malcolm was appointed as a minister and national spokesman for the Nation of Islam. Elijah Muhammad also charged him with establishing new mosques in cities such as Detroit and Harlem. Malcolm utilized newspaper columns as well as radio and television to communicate the NOI's message across the United States. His charisma, drive, and conviction attracted an astounding number of new members. Malcolm was largely credited with increasing membership in the NOI from 500 in 1952 to 30,000 in 1963. The crowds and controversy surrounding Malcolm made him a media magnet. He was featured in a week-long television special with Mike Wallace in 1959 called The Hate That Hate Produced. The program explored the fundamentals of the NOI and tracked Malcolm's emergence as one of its most important leaders. After the special, Malcolm was faced with the uncomfortable reality that his fame had eclipsed that of his mentor, Elijah Muhammad. In addition to the media, Malcolm's vivid personality had captured the government's attention. As membership in the NOI continued to grow, FBI agents infiltrated the organization, with one even acting as Malcolm's bodyguard. They would secretly place bugs, wiretaps, cameras, and other surveillance equipment to monitor the group's activities. Malcolm's faith was dealt a crushing blow at the height of the Civil Rights Movement in 1963. It was at that time that Malcolm learned that his mentor and leader, Elijah Muhammad, was secretly having relations with as many as 6 women within the Nation of Islam organization. As if that were not enough, Malcolm found out that some of these relationships had resulted in children. Malcolm would make a pilgrimage over to the birthplace of the Islamic faith, Mecca, over in Saudi Arabia. It was at this moment that he discovered that there were adherents to the Islamic faith of every race, shade, color, and hue. It was at that time that Malcolm decided, in concert with the revelations that he had recently learned about his mentor, that the time had come to sever his ties with the Nation of Islam, to follow a more conventional or mainstream version of the Islamic faith. Malcolm established an independent mosque in Harlem in 1964, and it was at that juncture that we start to witness some moderation in his rhetoric about his willingness to work with other civil rights leaders, including Martin Luther King Jr., who earlier he had derided in some of his speeches. But it was Malcolm's poignant gift of words, or gift with the language, that remains the hallmark of his legacy. Malcolm X became the most prominent spokesman for Black power and Black nationalism. He promoted the civil rights struggle as a fight for human rights and connected it directly to independent struggles in the emerging countries of Africa and Asia. Malcolm X stressed Black beauty and race pride, advising Blacks to reject the Negro label. He believed that by embracing the term Black, Blacks directly challenged the idea of white beauty and white supremacy. The Black Panther Party was founded in 1966 by Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale and was based on ideas such as black nationalism and a staunch belief in the necessity of violence and armed self-defense in order to obtain freedom from white oppression. These were both ideas that were strongly associated with Malcolm X's life work. Following Malcolm X's assassination in 1965, it had been suggested by some historians that the Black Panther Party used his philosophy of gaining freedom by any means necessary, both as a justification of their methods and as a means of inspiring other African Americans to join their cause. Although Huey Newton later stressed in his autobiography a belief that the party had not done things the way that Malcolm X would have had he lived beyond 1965, the fact that Malcolm X had a huge influence on the philosophy of the party is indisputable. It is also clear that Malcolm X had a strong influence on the individual, personal philosophies of key Black Panther members, especially the two founding members, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. Both were drawn in by Malcolm's speeches and agreed with many of the revolutionary ideas he expressed within them. Bobby Seale wrote about listening to Malcolm X's speeches, proclaiming him to be, quote, an even better speaker than Martin Luther King. He went on to name his son Malik, later explaining Malik was for Malcolm X. After Malcolm's death, Seale wrote that he cried like a baby and announced soon afterwards, "I will make my own self into an MFing Malcolm X. They'll have to kill me." In the process, Seale made clear the extent to which Malcolm X had influenced his beliefs. Huey Newton's personal philosophies were similarly influenced by Malcolm X in the years prior to the formation of the Black Panther Party. Newton claimed that Malcolm's work with the Organization of Afro-American Unity was one of the main sources of inspiration for him eventually forming the Black Panther Party. He gave him enormous credit in paving the way for the party's eventual rise. Newton was sure that despite leaders like Martin Luther King's advocacy of nonviolence and the struggle of civil rights, Malcolm X, with his policy of armed self-defense, had the only philosophy which could bring real success in the struggle against white oppression. Newton wrote that he saw the Black Panther Party as, quote, a living testament to Malcolm X's life work. And Newton was especially influenced by Malcolm's desire to help educate Black people and encourage a sense of Black pride and an appreciation in their heritage. While pop culture has reduced the legacy of the Black Panther Party to gun-toting, black beret-wearing individuals, it's important to note that this was a real, very real, social and political grassroots effort to bring about justice and freedom and equality to sectors of the Black community that frankly felt left behind by the civil rights movement of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., with its emphasis on desegregating public spaces such as hotels and restaurants. The Black Panther Party was seeking empowerment at the grassroots level on a more substantive level and a substantive basis. They put together an agenda that they refer to as their 10-point program. And in reading and reviewing the various aspects of this agenda, look at how very basic these needs and their demands appear to be. Number one, we want freedom. We want power to determine the destiny of our Black community. We want full employment of our people. We want an end to the robbery by the white man of our Black community. We want decent housing. fit for shelter of human beings. We want education for our people that exposes the true nature of this decadent American society. We want education that teaches us our true history and our role in the present-day society. We want all black men to be exempt from military service. This is particularly significant in light of the raging Vietnam War that was happening against the backdrop of the publication of this agenda. We want an immediate end to police brutality and murder of black people. We want freedom for all black men held in federal, state, county, and city prisons and jails. We want all black people, when brought to trial, to be tried in court by a jury of their peer group or people from black communities as defined by the Constitution of the United States. We want land, bread, housing, education, clothing, justice, and peace. None of these demands seem, frankly, that unreasonable or that radical on their face. Shown on the right-hand side of your screen was then Governor Ronald Reagan of California. Later, of course, Ronald Reagan would go on to become the 40th President of the United States. And as a conservative Republican, it's hard to conceive, given the current Republican Party's stances on guns and weapons, it's hard to conceive of a time when Republicans, one as conservative as Ronald Reagan himself, ever would have been for gun control measures. But Ronald Reagan was actually just that kind of politician, and indeed, throughout his political career, he had always advocated for strong gun control measures. As president, he used executive order to ban the importation of certain shotguns, and he later threw his weight behind the Brady Bill and 1994's assault weapons ban. This was no doubt informed by the fact that he himself was the victim of a near assassination attempt just months into his first term in office. As governor of California, Reagan signed the Mulford Act into law in 1967. Written by Republican Assemblyman Don Mulford, the legislation was the most sweeping state edict in all of the country, more or less prohibiting the free carrying of firearms in public. It went along with the rest of Reagan's entire law and order agenda and inspired an avalanche of new gun laws nationwide. Now, it would appear that the purpose of this law, and others like it, was to disarm the Black Panthers, which they viewed as a radical leftist group who openly carried firearms, who made no secret to their suspicion of police officers. So they would patrol neighborhoods to keep an eye on the police. They even took their rifles to the state capitol, which is the picture that you see pictured to the left there, to protest what they decried as a racist law. So again, it's hard to conceive of a time when Republicans were actually against such things as open carry laws, but as history shows us, it depended on who was doing the open carrying as to whether or not they would actually support the practice. For his part, Lyndon Johnson saw progress in the civil rights movement and so regretted what he viewed was its militant turn. He still saw that there was work that still needed to be done, particularly in his war on poverty. He linked the effort to reduce poverty to the fight for Black civil rights. Like Johnson, Dr. King also saw that Black poverty and unemployment related to racism were significant problems that still needed attention. Though he had put the goal of economic equality on the back burner to avoid accusations of communism, King understood it to be a key part of the struggle. Despite civil rights gains, Black unemployment continued to outpace white joblessness, particularly among Black teens. Blacks earned far less than whites on average, and most whites justified this growing economic divide as a result of white superiority. White employers perpetuated these divisions by barring Black workers from skilled work. And white politicians, even liberals, resisted federal programs that were meant to level the economic playing field. Well, during and after World War II, Blacks migrated out of the South for better jobs and wages in urban industry. But in the decades after the war, the decline of manufacturing industries and the relocation of companies overseas or to rural regions meant fewer jobs for urban Black workers, particularly unskilled laborers. Urban deindustrialization and Black migration also triggered white flight to the suburbs. Whites relocated from integrated cities to exclusively white neighborhoods and schools. Suburban shopping malls and new highways facilitated this flight. Urban renewal programs meant to rebuild cities devastated by deindustrialization or black flight often destroyed communities of color. As whites fled the city, public housing became more accessible to Black residents. But many of these projects were poorly built and placed in already impoverished, unsightly neighborhoods. This often resulted in the concentration and isolation of Black poverty. The effects of the urban crisis on Blacks exposed institutional racism. Institutions, not just individuals and laws, that worked to reinforce the idea of white supremacy. This idea informed activist arguments about prejudice, particularly as it related to economic and judicial discrimination. As America moved into the late 1960s and the presidency of Lyndon Johnson began to fade in the rearview mirror, America elected what had been probably the most conservative president in recent American history in Richard Nixon. Nixon used his Southern strategy to attract Southern whites to the Republican Party. Southern whites who felt disaffected by the Democratic Party's recent support of civil rights legislation. Nixon moved the federal government further to the right by appointing conservatives to head domestic agencies. He also made moves to curtail school integration, affirmative action, and anti-poverty programs. As part of his Southern strategy, Nixon allowed the FBI to infiltrate and destroy the Black Panther Party. These efforts led to inter-organizational violence and even assassinations. The publicity of trials that placed Black Panthers such as Huey Newton, Bobby Seale, and Angela Davis at the forefront further convinced the new right of the need for so-called law and order. This would spark what Richard Nixon would declare as a war on illicit drugs. In 1971, the chief and primary targets of which were African Americans. The Black radicals who had been placed on trial became, for many whites, the symbol of what was wrong with the Black liberation struggle. And a program that Johnson had put in place to mitigate decades of race-based discrimination in the workforce and also with regards to educational access, affirmative action came under attack under Richard Nixon's presidency. Conservatives opposed it, but they didn't do much about it until Nixon took office. Nixon was an ally. Add to this the growing inflation problems with employment, and so-called stagflation, all of which had the effect of intensifying competition for jobs, all helped opponents to launch their attack on affirmative action. Opponents targeted systems that aimed to increase the numbers of minorities in college and professional programs. They referred to them as quota systems, saying they unfairly gave spots to unqualified people. They argued that this was un-American and even went so far as to call such efforts reverse discrimination, which ironically was an admission on their part that inequity in school admissions did exist. But for the brief 4-year interruption of the Carter presidency, America's march to a more conservative brand of politics continued into the 1980s. President Ronald Reagan, remember him, former governor of California, pushed Nixon's conservative policies even further. He rolled back federal welfare and job programs. And in the South, when he first announced his intention to run for the presidency in 1980, he made this announcement in the very small Mississippi community that was the site of the murder of 3 civil rights workers in 1964. When he made his campaign announcement from Philadelphia, Mississippi, he announced his support for states' rights and declared that discrimination was a myth. Reagan scapegoated welfare queens, or supposedly irresponsible black women, who exploited federal handouts to justify major cuts to federal welfare assistance and job training programs. He also derailed the agencies. Tasked with enforcing equity in employment and ordered his Attorney General to fight against affirmative action. Reagan furthered Nixon's war on drugs. He federalized laws that increased prison sentences for drug possession. These laws disproportionately affected blacks and Latinos. Plus, the publicity of the drug wars focused the nation's attention on inner-city neighborhoods. Slum life, therefore, was framed as a result of drug use rather than as the result of broader issues like deindustrialization and discrimination. Reagan turned federal courts to the right by appointing conservative federal judges. He also appointed staunch conservative Antonin Scalia to the Supreme Court and promoted another conservative, William Rehnquist, to Chief Justice. Within the black community, class divisions grew. In the late 20th century, the upper classes became increasingly distinct from the poor, newly termed the underclass. This often referred to urban blacks who were underskilled and unable to find work in the new post-industrial economy. Extreme poverty contributed to high rates of crime and incarceration among black men. Crack, its use, contributed to and resulted from the problems faced by the underclass. Some used the cheap addictive drug to remedy the misery of poverty, while others sold it to make ends meet. Either way, when this drug first made its appearance on the streets of America in the mid-1980s, with usage that reached its peak in the mid-1990s, it increased black-on-black crime, the illicit sex trade, and black incarceration. Add to this the AIDS epidemic. AIDS and the slow government response to it also disproportionately affected Black men and women. By 1990, AIDS had become one of the leading causes of death among adult Black men and women. Even when new treatments became available, fewer Blacks had the resources to pay for the drugs. Democratic President Bill Clinton promised some relief for the Black poor through his endorsement of the minimum wage, the Earned Income Tax Credit for the working poor, and health and education programs for the most disadvantaged. Still, to please his conservative supporters, he ultimately backed away from many of these pledges and even made moves to end, quote, welfare as we know it. When the Black middle and working classes did not protest the end to welfare, it became clear that conservative campaigns against welfare recipients had succeeded. The Black middle class, including prominent Black figures of the era, like now disgraced comedian Bill Cosby, accepted the idea that the Black poor were not doing enough to help themselves. So with this, the question becomes, what's next? What's next in the saga of the experience of African Americans in this country? Of course, we had the election and subsequent re-election of President Barack Obama. And as of this recording, we have just witnessed the confirmation of the first ever Black female to the highest court in the land. But not enough historical perspective has been gained yet. Not enough time has elapsed since the occurrence of these events, both the election of Barack Obama and the installation of Ketanji Brown Jackson to the Supreme Court. So that saga is still being written. But I want to just say in closing that it has been my pleasure to serve as your instructor in African American history this semester, and I really hope that through attending these lectures and reading the textbook that was so carefully put together for your consideration, that you have gained a better understanding and a better appreciation for the experiences of a community that has given so much to this country. Thank you for your attention.